Hi, editing me here. Just a quick little thing. So I'm gonna just give a preface to this whole entire video and why I'm posting it if there is a trigger warning on it and what that trigger warning is about. Basically, the story has somebody who is a victim of a sexual assault, and so, which obviously, they don't go into too graphic of like it doesn't go into graphic detail about the actual event, but it's mostly about her dealing with it. Now, not that's the whole entire story isn't about that, although parts of it come into play and why she is the way she is. So they kind of need to have that kind of backstory. Having read the first part of but this happens within the first chapters where it's really overt, and I can't remember everything because it's been too long. I've been away from the video for too long, but I struggled with this a lot about whether or not to actually go ahead with this after I'd read out this one part. And I know that after that I pulled everything back and I talked around it a lot. But then I took part in a critique, and because I was worried, I was very, very concerned about making sure that, it was very real. It was very, it was her emotions, the way she reacted were very in keeping with how someone would react when placed in that kind of situation, and as a survivor. So she would, these are things she would have felt. Not all people feel this way, but not all people react this way, but these are valid reactions. Contrast to the critique, I was part of a critique session where this is where my thing came in, because I was very hesitant to continue on with this until I came across this critique session, and I was just reading this story while the critique session. It was kind of like in answer to this, because wherein I was trying to be very, very careful and making sure that that it is being very the way it's being talked about is respectful. And it's a sensitive topic, so that's why there's going to be trigger warnings throughout the whole entire thing, even though it's not necessarily overt, and there's nothing it's not too graphic. When I say that, I mean, yeah, anyway. My choice to go through with it was when I came across this critique session, and the person who has a very long running, they are very prolific with their stories, and I felt they were very casual with their discussion about people who had been sexually assaulted, and that casualness that people just picked up and went on, and that's not the case, and that's not what's going on in this story, in the story that I'm about to tell you. It's very, yeah, it's not the same as if the story that I had critiqued, where it was very casual, it was very, oh, this happened and away you go. In this story, however, like in the story I'm about to tell you, it is dealt with and she's still working through her emotions on it. She's still working on getting to a place to be able to move on. She hasn't moved on from any of the trauma yet. And I do, in that, I think this is a good story to read. Because it does deal with somebody trying to move past trauma. And so therefore I think it's, when I see other people not dealing with it dealing with these topics in a respectful manner at all, then I feel that, yeah, this can be that story. This can be that story that counters acts those other stories that are out there, all those other stories that are out there that just treat sexual trauma like a, oh, and then you go on with your life. Which, yeah, so that's why I continue to read the story, and that's why, even though there might be some parts that are hard, I feel it's an important story to talk about. And I know this is rambly, but that's fine. And frankly, that's just the way it's going to be. I'm going to put this in at the beginning. Yeah, and we'll see how the YouTube censors deal with it. Because Twitch seemed to be okay with it, even though there was some, like, I read it verbatim. So, and this video will have a verbatim. Everything else will have me just talking about, it'll be pulled back and everything like that, because I wasn't sure of Twitch guidelines and how strenuous they were. Anyway, having said that, I will let you go on to the video. Take care. Thank you. I wanted to come back, but hello everybody. Alrighty, so for those of you who are just tuning in, I'm actually starting up again with another novel. I've got quite a few of them. There, it's not really mine; it's my dad's, but that's okay. I'm only happy to share it with you. This one is also a little bit different from the last genre that I was working with. This one apparently, well, it starts off modern, and I think it does some traveling. That's what I gathered from the synopsis. I'm a little unclear. Also, I'm really not sure how this one is going to compare to the other stories, because I kind of like the other stories. This one, I don't know. It has some, like, I'd already read a little bit of it already, and now I just want to go through the whole entire rest of it. We'll see, because I think this might be a trunk novel, like an Uber trunk novel, like, not like even beyond the Wolf Talisman. That one needed a lot of heavy work. Not horrible. This one may need like heavy work. But I won't know until I read, and neither will you. So without further ado, I bring you what is called The Plague Wizards. And chapter 1. Alison McHarg looked through the metal fence. The tree was only remarkable in that it couldn't exist. It looked as if it should be a poplar, but there were, it was said, subtle differences in leaf shape and texture of bark. She clucked her tongue against her teeth. She might just have to go to the farmer who owned the land and pay him the exorbitant fee to have the gate unlocked so she could have a closer look. She shook her head at that thought. He'd had people tramping all over his land for weeks, and had eventually put up a fence just to keep people away. He'd set a steep fee, not an expectation of getting rich, but just to keep everyone from pestering him to open the gate. The thing was, now she'd come all the way to this little bit of Scottish shoreline, it'd be a waste of time to go back without actually looking at the thing. Close range. The farmer, one Glenn Alexander, had changed his story about the tree. First off, he said he'd suddenly found it grown to sapling size one morning. That, of course, had brought about a spate of people who knew that this tree had been left by visitors from outer space. Mr. Alexander later changed that story to a more believable one about how he'd never noticed a tree before. Botanists had come in and argued over it, claiming that it must be a mutant of this or that variety. Cuttings had been taken, with hefty payments to Mr. Alexander, but one and all had refused to grow. It proved to be remarkably difficult to extract DNA from it, and when it was done, researchers claimed that something was wrong with the sample, since this DNA could not exist. Altogether, it had been a 6 weeks wonder, after which other things had come along, and this impossible tree was shifted off to the back burner. Allison, a biologist from Toronto, who had specialized in medicinal herbs, had decided to allow herself to have a look at the thing. A little book of hers, written under a pseudonym, describing a whole list of medicinal herbs, their preparation and uses, had made her enough money that, carefully spent, it could support a short visit to Scotland. So here she was, looking at the impossible tree and feeling annoyed. Not that she couldn't afford to pay Mr. Alexander. She'd been careful with her money, so that was no real problem. The thing was, she just didn't like to go talking to some strange man. And that was... No, she cut off that thought path. She'd gotten past it, through it, though obviously not over it, but she wouldn't let herself dwell on it. It looked as if she might find a better view down there a ways, to her left. She moved along the fence. The sky went dark. Her head began to buzz, and in her ears was a long chant in some strange language. Pain blazed in her chest, numbness down her arms, and even as she recognized the symptoms of a heart attack, they were gone as if they'd never been. She stumbled on the ground, caught herself, and stood upright. Pain blazed in her chest, numbness ran down her arms, and even... No sign of the fence, no sign of the tree. In fact, it seemed to be early morning, and she could barely make out the trees around her. She shook her head. Something was wrong here. There hadn't been more than a few trees here. She felt strange, and tried to figure out what had happened. Not likely a heart attack, or she'd be dead. What happened to her pack-sack? That seemed to have gone, with what little contained in the way of survival supplies. The dress she had on, that stopped her. She'd gone out this morning in a pair of blue jeans, hiking boots, and a cotton shirt. Now she was wearing some kind of rough cloth dress, and no underwear that she could feel. On her feet were a pair of soft leather boots, but not in any style she'd ever seen, fastened with a series of large hooks going into thumb-sized eyes. I think perhaps I should panic about now? She turned around again, looking in all directions. A narrow path wound through the forest to her right. For want of any better goal, she wandered off in that direction. It was a well-used path, worn several inches below the ground's surface in some places. She could see traces of tracks, though none of them meant anything to her. "I do plants, not animals," she muttered, "and plants don't have feet." She noticed the scent of the forest, mostly because it was different from the scent of the particular part of Scotland she'd been standing in. There was some similarity about it, as there was similarity about every forest she'd visited. But just like every forest she'd visited, there were differences. This one had a faint hint of spice about it. She looked both ways along the path. Next decision, which way to go. Or just stand here waiting to be rescued. She looked both ways along the path. Next decision, which way to go. Or just stand here waiting to be rescued. She bent down and picked up a twig from the ground. She tossed it in the air. Whichever way the narrow end points, that's the direction I'll go. And of course, the narrow end landed pointing pretty much straight off into the woods. "Bad test," she muttered. "Let's try that again. Facing along the trail this time." The stick went up, and came back down, pointing toward her. It didn't turn over. Might as well pointed that in that direction and headed out. Try again. 2 more tries had the stick falling down butt first, then toppling to point off the trail to left or right. She was beginning to feel as if she were getting just a little fixated on having the stick really point away for her to go. This time it fell butt first, then pointed into the forest, but just a little off to the right angle. She bent down to pick it up again, then thought, Fudge, no, it's just pointing up a little that way. No more fooling around, girl. Get your rear in gear. Still holding the stick, for no other reason than it hadn't occurred to her to toss it aside, she started tentatively up the hill. She began noticing footprints in the dust. Hoof prints, actually. 3 pointed hooves, each as long as her own foot, or longer. No lions or tigers or bears so far, though I don't know if I could tell a bear print from a giraffe. Having picked a direction to travel, she did not bother moving fast. One direction was likely as good as any other, and moving was at least not standing still. The light grew rapidly better, and she could make out trees and plants around her. None of them were recognizable, though none of them were extremely odd. The leaves were all of greenish hues, and most of the trees seemed to be near relatives to the tree she'd gone to see. Now, how should she refer to that, back on Earth? Well, maybe just back there. She never had much patience with the people who described at great detail and very vague at some points their abduction by space aliens. This didn't seem to be like that. For one thing, she hadn't been taken aboard some ship or operated on or anything like that. One instant she'd been there, and now she was here, dressed like this. Stop it, girl. You're about to toss yourself into a panic. Don't think about that. Look at what's here, and play botanist. Give your mind something to do. Then something even weirder began to happen. She seemed to know names for a lot of the plants, particularly the trees. The worst of it was that the names were not English nor French, nor any other language he'd heard of. Some of them seemed to have deeper meanings, as though made up of 2 or 3 words. But she had no meanings for those words. On the other hand, she got several color terms attached to words that had no meaning, other than that particular plant. But why did blue cover some shades of green as well? No, don't be quite so Anglo-centric. Field trips to wild countries taught her that colors could and did fall in different categories depending on the language. Worse than operations. The aliens have mucked around with my head. She stopped. This was just getting too scary. She wasn't sure what she might have done next if she hadn't seen movement up ahead, and immediately afterward made it out for the shape of a man. People? Are they friendly or hostile? Whoever's playing games with me, they wouldn't just drop me down where the next people along would kill me, would they? And if I run, where should I run to? In the end, sheer inertia kept her where she was as the men, 3 of them, came closer down the hill. They had brown hair, save for one who had black hair, and their hair was tied with a cloth or leather band tied around the forehead. They wore trousers, calf length. Their feet were bare. 2 wore sleeveless vests that laced up the front. The leader's chest was bare. They were all carrying spears, carrying them as if they were very familiar with their use. Panic started up again. But now she beat it down, using some hard-learned techniques. 3 with spears. Not much hope against them. They turned out to be hostile. Running wasn't a much better option. They could run her down fairly soon if one of them didn't just save the bother by throwing a spear into her fleeing back. The leader looked at her with no expression showing on his face. He spoke to her. Malum Iktishal Vren Gil? She was about to answer, "What's that, Klingon?" when she suddenly realized she understood him. What he said was, "Do you come in peace?" The comprehension also hinted that this was more than just a polite phrase of greeting, but a question of her intentions as well. She answered in the same language. I come in peace. Whoever had put the language in her mind hadn't managed to force her mouth to form the sounds correctly, so even she knew she sounded foreign. She couldn't quite get the stress pattern right, and the L had a strange quality to it that nearly defeated her. The leader looked puzzled for a moment, then spoke a phrase similar to the one he'd spoken before, but without the j at the end, which made it a statement rather than a question this time. Yes, she answered. I come in peace. One of the men in back muttered a word that meant foreigner. Actually, she realized the word meant more than foreigner. It seemed to carry overtones of untrustworthy as well. She also hoped she wasn't left alone with that fellow at any time. There was something in his face that brought back memories she'd rather not recall. But the leader paid little attention. He was concentrating on her. Unlike the other man, he appeared to be looking at her as she was, weighing all the evidence of her appearance and her somewhat flawed ability in the language. He finally nodded. She's the one the woman told us of. Let's go. The word he used for woman meant something more. Something like studious woman. But even that didn't seem to fit. Walk along the path, just in front of us, please. This was a polite request, not a command, so there seemed to be nothing to be gained by arguing. Less, she had no grounds for arguing, no place she could actually claim as a preferable destination. It wasn't much further before she began to smell wood smoke. Shortly after that, they were coming to cultivated fields. The fields had been cleared of most trees and all underbrush, with rocks dug out and stacked beside the fields. In the fields were mostly stands of what looked to be cereal crops, though she knew the names and something of their uses, mostly they were just names to her. The village, or whatever one would call the conglomeration of huts from which the fields radiated, consisted of low log buildings with peaked roofs thatched with straw. None of them appeared to have windows. There was a smell to the village, too. A smell of turned earth, of rotting vegetation, and of bodily waste. No, worse really than some back alley she'd hurried past back home. No worse really than some back alley she'd hurried past back home. There was no wall around the village, but the look of the men's spears suggested to her that the men were willing and able to defend themselves, suggesting further that there were enemies to be defended against, though likely not so numerous as to require the effort of building a wall. At this point, the leader of the trio said, the woman's house. Which one is that? The houses all seem essentially the same. He made a noise of exasperation. The woman's house! The Vine house! She considered a moment, defending herself as a stranger who didn't know these things. That seemed likely to cause more problems. The Vine was none that she had ever seen. In fact, the vocabulary in her head didn't even have a specific word for it. She jumped as a voice behind her shouted, Kua! Moralai! Here she is! The door opened and a woman stepped out. Allison was beginning to wonder if there were differences between the language she'd been taught and the local dialect. Maybe studious meant wise? Perhaps the proper translation was, the woman was short and trim, with longish brown hair. Allison looked up and down, and didn't seem to like what she saw. You're the cause of it, then? Which annoyed Allison. No, she shot back. I didn't cause anything. 1 minute I was back in my own country looking at a tree I'd never seen before. The next minute I was here. None of my doing. If you know how to put me back, I'd be pleased. The woman thought minimally. Not a wizardess, then? No. She considered it for an instant, saying, just a botanist, but decided that would open up all kinds of other topics she might not want to get into. Such as, if the plants were so different from what she knew back home, then her story might seem to be a lie. So then, well, come on in. We'll talk inside. Morley stepped back and to the right and let Allison come in. As Allison was stepping across the threshold, she felt a pat on her behind. As tightly wound as she was, the reaction was immediate. She spun around, her left hand whipping up towards where a face would be. The man himself began to step back, so the move was a snap kick to the groin. Later on, going over the matter in her mind, she suspected that the business of coming over to this world had put her timing off just slightly, because instead of a solid hit, her foot only grazed him, enough to send him staggering away, spear falling from his hand. Then the shirtless leader had his spear up and ready to thrust. Allison knew that, barehanded against someone who knew how to use a spear, she was in trouble. She settled into a defensive stance. Darrow! The woman's voice was commanding. Bland got what someone should have given him years ago. Lady, whatever your name is, relax. I'll have no bloodshed on my threshold. Allison heard in that more than a command not to kill, but of bad luck following the very act of shedding blood on the threshold of the house. She pulled herself out of the rigorously drilled-in self-defense mode, an act that required more than shifting hands and feet to a neutral mode. It required also pulling her mind out of the state where nothing counted but protection of self. It was difficult, in the face of that still poised spear blade. Her mind was saying first, no one's going to get me that easily again. This was followed by, does this mean I'm not over it yet? Her mind flashed back briefly to that night, waking alone in her room, with that man standing over her bed. Stop it, girl, that's past. It's never going to happen again. She turned to look at Morley, who was looking her over. The wise woman nodded. Something still haunts you, then? No, don't bother trying to talk about it. Darrow, thank you and your men for bringing her safe here. You might try to convince Bland that those kinds of liberties should have been stretched out for the burial rites, but I doubt he'll listen. A seeing, Morley? I see very seldom, Darrow. Sometimes I read the way a present course of events may end, but it's only how they may end. If someone chooses to adjust his behavior, the outcome is likely to be different. Thank you. You may go. I will remember your assistance. As Darrow and his men left, Lorelei closed the door and turned to Allison. May I ask a name of you? I'm called Allison. Allison, eh? Well, Allison, magic brought you here. Most likely magic done by someone in the city, she muttered almost to herself. What are they up to now in the city? Allison shrugged, hoping the gesture had the same meaning here. The question seemed to be rhetorical anyway. Morley was thinking. Well, they'll likely be coming to look for you sometime. I suppose we'd better keep you until we can send someone to the city, or until they can find out where you are. This is a small village, though, and everyone has to help out, or we don't live. What sorts of things can you do? Allison understood what she was being told. A guest was a guest, but if the guest waited long enough, they ought to help out somehow. It was well known, too, that city people weren't of much use on a farm. Connection with the magicians suggested that Allison was a city person herself. Instead of answering that question, Allison asked one of her own. How far is it to the city? About 3 weeks' trip, but nobody in town can be spared to take you there. Not for 6 weeks or more. But I can't... No, never mind. She'd been about to do the field worker to native thing of offering payment. Unfortunately, she had literally nothing but the clothes she wore. Furthermore, she had a feeling that the villagers had never seen money, and even if they had, they didn't really understand the concept. She'd have to earn her keep until someone from the city came to collect her. She couldn't believe they'd go to all the trouble of bringing her here just to abandon her. She felt her mouth go into a grim line. When they came, she'd give him, her, it, an earful. I see. Well, as for what I can do, I'd say I can lend a hand at what needs to be done, and I can learn fast. Can you indeed? Well, that's a help, if it's true. The implied doubt annoyed Allison. Unfortunately, without any real knowledge of the things villagers did as daily work, she was in no position to start an argument. I believe I can, was all she said. Morley gave her a considering look. So then, we'll have to see. Well, that was everything for this chapter. Again, this one's going to be, well, the chapters are longer, but there's less of them. So, probably going to be about this long every night. Maybe a little bit longer. I have a feeling this one's going to be a more challenging read. I'm hoping that it picks up a bit. This first chapter, though, not a fan so far. It's really, really rough and needs a lot of work. But I'm just hoping that if I keep on going, that the story might get better. Otherwise, this might be one of the ones where I'm doing like mostly edits in. I have a few stories like that already. They probably were originally intended to be trunk novels only, except for I'm pretty sure some of them were sent off to publishers. But I don't know. Anyway, so this is the first chapter of Plague Wizards, and I will talk to you all again soon. Have a good night.